Good morning, and welcome to the first interview of this year's Sustainable Future Week. My name is Federica Di Sario. I'm a climate reporter, and as you can see, I'm delighted to be joined on the stage by Laurence Toubiana. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the European Climate Foundation, and she's really, for everybody who's ever worked on climate policy, a sacred cow of the international climate talks. So she clearly now she's the CEO of the European Climate Foundation, but she's mostly known for being one of the leading figures and key architects behind the Paris Agreement, which is the deal struck in 2015, which we all look up to and that we are trying to protect. Laurence has had a great mix of what we need to persist in the climate action, which is a mix of desire to act. She has worked, she has held several positions within the governments and NGOs as well, which she has often funded herself. But also to think deeply about the environmental issue. And she has also held several positions within the academia. She has been a professor at Sciences Po Paris and at Columbia University. So I think that's exactly what we need in this moment to go forward. So thank you so much, Laurence, for joining the Sustainable Future Week at Politico. As first question, I cannot avoid asking more about your expectation for COP21. I mean, 21. Well, for COP28. Unlike last year we had an interview with Al Gore just a week after, probably 2 weeks after the end of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now the situation is a bit different. So I would like to hear your expectations for the climate talks this year, and especially considering the exacerbated geopolitical landscape that we are all witnessing.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me and for your kind words of introduction. Of course, the context was not particularly easy in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, but of course it has evolved in a very, very tough direction. One on what was already there in Sharm was, of course, the consequences of the invasion of Ukraine and, of course, on the energy prices. And we felt already that the oil and gas sector in particular was, of course, in a different mood than what we have witnessed, for example, in Glasgow in 2021 or even in previous COP, because, of course, all the thinking about the end of fossil fuel, what was being, in a way, considered as somehow activities that were potentially a stranded asset in the future, that was no more the context in Sharm, and of course not at all now for Dubai. On top of that, of course, the Israel-Gaza drama and conflict, because it's both a drama and a conflict, we see that, of course, the global tension between the global south, which were already very, very visible last year, are, of course, mounting another degree of confrontation. Meanwhile, there are as well, it's finally probably a more nuanced perspective, but it's not visible from outside, because in particular, of course, we have seen again some months ago the increase of members of what the group we call BRICS, which of course, it rallies most of emerging countries, but now with many big oil producers like Iran, Saudi Arabia, or the Emirates. And that means that the political context is, as you said, pretty different. So COP28 is important because, of course, it's different from last year. It's a moment where the mechanism of Paris Agreement has a very important milestone, which is a balance. Maybe just to give you a perspective, we have several agreements on climate. In particular, Kyoto was a sort of have a timeline, a sunset clause, 2020. When I discussed, and I remember it was in Brussels, the discussion of how to, and preparing for the negotiation, the idea that the agreement has to be no sunset clause. It has to be to keep going, not having what it was mostly the US and China position. We decided for a plan or an agreement for 10 years, and then every 10 years we renegotiate the agreement. I felt it was not at that time the good solution for the time we take to negotiate agreements. But so for the exact reason, we need a revision clause. Of course, if you don't have sunset clause, you have to have revision clause. And the revision clause is today at that COP, in COP28, to make the balance of what we have achieved and, of course, in a way, initiate what we call the ratchet up mechanism. That is how the new climate plan that has to be proposed by the country at COP30 for 2030 and beyond, in particular for beyond 2030, has to be really in line with the objective of Paris Agreement. So it's a sort of a test year for the Paris Agreement reality and its efficiency, even if we can consider that from 2015, we have made progress in many elements, electrification of the transport sector, for example, the still ongoing acceleration of progress in renewable energy, in particular in investment. So there are many signs that now agriculture, which was a very difficult sector, is now in discussion. So there are many elements that you see moving, but we know that we are not on track. We are off track from the objective, in particular for the global warming on 1.5. But that's true in a context where, if I may say so, the fossil fuel sector is, I'm in that job since with different hats from 30 years. And we have high and lows. And now we are in a moment where probably the fossil fuel sector see a risk, a serious risk, because of course climate events are just now, and all societies are feeling it and want to have reaction. But at the same time see themselves, if they can propose themselves as a solution, which is, will be, of course, a discussion at 20.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you precisely about this, because, the elephant in the room regarding COP28, which is going to be held in Dubai, is really that it's going to be held in a petrostate, and the president designate of COP28, Sultan Al-Jaber, is himself what people would describe as an oil guy, so an oil executive. So how do you think this is going to impact the negotiations, and what does it mean for the oil and gas industry to be the much on the spotlight?
So on one side, it's good because the elephant in the room is visible. It's not behind the scene. There will be a number of representatives for the oil and gas and coal sector at Dubai, more than in Glasgow, which were already quite a number of them. So in a way, and it's needed that the discussion we had very clearly that what do we do on fossil fuel? And that will be the discussion, one of the discussion, but a very important one. Do we have an agreement on the phase out of fossil fuel, by when, and what are the specifics we want to put around that? And we know that we have a range of positions. More or less, everybody agrees that we have to phase down, not to phase out. But now, even last year, the idea was introduced that we should not focus on the fuels themselves, but on the emissions. Meaning, if we can capture the emission of the oil and gas sector or the coal sector, if we can store them, we can have zero emissions, at least that's the theory, and finally continue the business as usual in the sector. There was a very interesting reflection from the CEO of a very famous oil company, American oil company and gas company, Occidental. And Vicky Pollack said, because we know how to do direct air capture of CO2, we can continue our job like normal. And that, of course, depends on the capacity of the carbon capture and sequestration reality. And that will be the discussion at COP. How much we can think that we can extract all the emission of the oil and gas sector, or how unrealistic is this? And I hope we will have a discussion. Of course, we need to phase out fossil fuel. That's very evident. You look at the IEA report year after year. But we will need some fossil fuels, at least around 2050. So can we reserve this fossil fuel for very specific activities, because very difficult in the sectors like industry, for example, or do we have a sort of vision that we can continue business as usual? That will be the discussion at COP28.
What do you think will be the role of the European Union in this discussion in particular?
I think the European Union has started just defining its position at the last Council on the 16th of October. And of course, it was a hard battle, as you know. Of course, because some countries are really worried about being too clear about the phase out. So this notion that we can abate some emissions is in the conclusion. But then, as I think the Spanish presidency precised, we should, and that I think is the important thing, we need certainly fossil fuel and the abatement of this, because anyway, the science say whatever you want to do, the emission has to be net zero by 2050, and for Europe, for example, even before that. So I think the European Union is saying, and I hope this line will prevail, that we have to phase out, but we have, of course, to specify this unabated, this abatement for sectors that need that, and maybe describe these sectors and not say just it's for everybody. We should not have fossil fuel in the transport sector anymore because we know how to electrify. But we may need that for steel for a moment, or for cement for a moment. So that, I think, the position of EU, that I think is sophisticated. I don't know, frankly, in this COP, I would not bet any, I don't know what will happen. It's, the discussion is very, probably the conclusion is very, very open. And I don't know how conflictive or consensual it will be, frankly.
Mm. And staying on this reflection of the EU and how, how the EU is going to inject some momentum also in climate ambitions at COP28. One of the most recent announcements was made actually yesterday by the new Commissioner for Climate Action, Wopke Hoekstra, who finally made an announcement on the Loss and Damage Fund, which is obviously one of the big agenda items for this COP, and that was one of the biggest achievement of COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh. So he said that the EU will make a substantial contribution to the fund. And I was wondering, do you see that this attitude of the EU to be a sort of first mover will also convince other countries that are way more reluctant to make contributions to the fund, in the same way that the EU's position with Franz Timmermans at the past COP has actually changed completely the direction of the talks and finally led to the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund? Is it going to be pivotal to convince other countries, or at least to restore some trust?
Not totally. I was with Commissioner Hoekstra yesterday, and one is not only the commitment to the Loss and Damage Fund, the financial, it's very important. Again, as you said, it was EU that finally has sought out the compromise last year. In a way, I must say, at least informally, it was clear that US, even if China was not in favor of this fund. And so EU first mover or ability to bridge was very, very important. And I'm sure, of course, that the prolongation of that, which is very good. And just said that, as you may remember, the commissioner has committed to fight for 90% emission reduction by 2040 for EU, which is as well a very important sign, because we need to get to net zero before 2050 for developed countries. That's the only way to bring China and India just to really get to their net zero much earlier than what they have committed to. So this role of first mover is important. I will add, because anyway, we have to recognize that geopolitically we are not in an easy situation for all the Ukraine war, Israel and Gaza. And the fact that we have to bridge means that we have to recreate trust with other countries, in particular developing countries. And so we have to, not to patronize, but to offer good cooperation. And I think there is a vast array of potential there that I think the European Commission, the different member states, the different financial institutions of EU, in particular the EIB, can offer these partnerships that I think will recreate the good atmosphere we had at COP21, which of course is not there anymore.
Yeah.
I have another question I would like to share with you and thinking. I think we will have the COP30 in Brazil in 2 years. I don't know, again, as I said, what will happen this year. The next year, we don't know where the meeting will happen because of the geopolitical conflicts, and Russia, of course, imposition that no countries that have a relation with EU could be accepted as a next president. But we need to think maybe there may be 70,000 people, maybe more, coming to Dubai. A lot of pledges, no accountability of these pledges, voluntary pledges. I think if we want the Paris Agreement to really be efficient and survive, we need to create much more accountability. And I think all these pledges finally are not so positive because nobody understands finally if there are impact or not impact on these pledges. So I think we will see certainly a thinking and a reform of the COP system. I hope this will be open in the COP28 anyway, in particular the role of subnational actors, but nevertheless, we cannot continue to have these big fairs. That's not efficient. And in a way, even the political understanding of what is happening is really very, very difficult for public and society.
Yeah, this has been your position for a while. I mean, to pitch this increased role of non-state actors, because it's also a way to ensure that climate action continues no matter the political wind that is blowing. Do you think there is there are people that listen to this pitch? Do you think that there is an increasing interest towards this call for a reform of the COP process?
I think so. One, because this role of non-state actors was a important pillar of the Paris Agreement, because of course, you don't decide climate by a treaty. You don't influence, and governments alone cannot do the job. And climate action has to take place both look at IMF now, which is now a topic for IMF, or the World Bank, of course, or the private finance institutions. So it cannot be the government or countries that are in charge of the agreement that can deliver the job. So it's across the board. So this idea that you have the non-parties operating on climate action is just the evidence needed. Nevertheless, this has created a sort of overabundance of declaration. It was very, very evident in Glasgow, and now more and more people think that the COPs are about these pledges and not on the engagement and commitment of governments, and of course the verification of these commitments are delivered. So I think we have to integrate more these two processes, the outside COP, the outside negotiation, the inside. But for that, we cannot have all these pledges. We need mechanism just to check that everybody is serious, that it makes a difference. That's why I am proposing now, and we'll do that with Michael Bloomberg at the beginning of the COP, together, by the way, with the president of COP28, just to encourage government for the next round of their climate plan to come with the region or the states or the cities, but of different political structure and administrative sectors, depending on countries, but that they commit to be accountable to each other, that the California commitment is part of the US commitment as a whole, that Australia commitment comes with the provinces. And you may remember when there was, of course, another conservative government, all the provinces in Australia wanted to be consistent with Paris Agreement when, of course, the government in Canberra didn't want. So it's a safety net, but at the same time, it's creating a link of the international engagement of government vis-à-vis their own societies. And I hope this will progress this year.
Is this the future you see for the COP process? And like, you said that it can no longer be a business fair, but it will most likely continue to be a business fair. I mean, if it continues to go this way, how do you think that we can...
I think there are good and interesting ideas on the table. One is that the COP itself is a sort of landing point of many other discussions that are not taking place at the same time. I can take just a good example that I think we should deliver, if not this year, next year, is on methane. We need an instrument to tackle methane emission. We know that we have to really reduce massively methane emission, both from the oil and gas sector as well as agriculture. It's possible, it's not expensive, but we need maybe we need a particular legal instrument to really make the government and the private sector actors accountable to what they do. Look, in 2004, I think, the World Bank and a number of oil and gas companies decided to just launch a voluntary pledge of just stopping flaring on oil and gas. And we are in 2024, almost 2024, and so 20 years after, and now we are talking about doing something for 2030. So that's why, for example, ideally we'll have an agreement of methane, maybe a protocol, maybe an instrument that can contribute to the COP at the end. And we look, maybe we could, we have been talking about this agreement on sectors for many years, on cement, on steel. Maybe we should take sector by sector, because of course we need now more concrete implementation, but that has to be taken out of the COP and with more stronger legal instrument, if possible, and then brought to the COP. So that type of new structure, I'm thinking, and I'm certainly sure that will be the discussion this year and next year. And I'm sure that the Brazilian presidency is seeing that as an impossibility to replicate these big fairs.
Mm. And how likely do you think it is to achieve a breakthrough in the issue, which has been a taboo for a long time, of the international taxation on sectors like shipping and aviation, which are immensely polluting, but they are still escaping taxation? And also, I mean, obviously, we need this money because there has been a study recently by Wood Mackenzie saying that we will need, I think, $2.7 trillion per year to hit net zero by 2050. So how do we make sure that we can leverage this kind of innovative climate finance tools to be able to achieve this incredible amount of money, which is crazy at the moment?
Yes, what is evident that this amount of money is needed. Just to track, in Glasgow, there was a big hope that the private sector will come to complete what was anyway relatively limited as a public funding, because of course the fiscal space for many developed countries in particular is now more limited than ever because of the COVID debt plus the Ukraine plus inflation. And now of course higher interest rates. So, again, we have unlocked something which were really taboos some years ago, like the reform of the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, the capacity for World Bank to lend more with the same capital. We have the IMF, again, another taboo, encouraging countries to transfer their special drawing rights to developing countries, and this taking place now more. Kristalina Georgieva in Paris last week announced that we have more than 106 billion had been transferred or committed. But now we see that there is a limit. Even if World Bank lends much more, we are not close to these numbers. So that's why already in June in Paris, then in Nairobi in September at the African Climate Week, chaired by President Ruto from Kenya, the idea of having an effort of international taxation has to take place. So this international taxation task force, which I have the honor to lead, and I will be, of course, surrounded by many more, and that will be, of course, chaired by a number of head of states, will be launched at COP28. We will look for next year at a series of potential taxes. There are many opposition. It's a taboo. International taxation just is a taboo. Just talk about that to the many countries. Tax is a sovereignty issue. You cannot decide internationally. So that's a normal discussion. But we know that some discussions are taking place in IMO. We need to look at the in a way, aviation sector, which is, of course, one sector which doesn't pay carbon tax, for example, at all. We need to look at many others. There is, again, the reflection of the financial tax on financial transaction. So that will be a good diplomatic effort, a funny one, by the way, because a very difficult one, just to say who are the countries that are backing what kind of taxes. And probably will not have a consensus of one, but we may get some coalition of countries, and that could, in a way, provide for more funding for loss and damage, but as well for the energy transition in developing countries. So let's see what happens, but I think it's recognition, for example, that the enormous profit of the oil and gas sector in 2022 in particular, just it's normal to contribute to what, in a way, what the climate impacts are producing in many countries. So,
Great. I would now like to take a couple of questions from the swap card, and also encourage you, if you have any questions, to ask Laurence to send us. So those are a little bit more centered on the EU. Do you think that the EU's update of its climate plan, which didn't add a new target, was disappointing?
Well, you know, it's in EU, if we look back, one, we have delivered what we promised for 2020. We are doing even a little better than we expected. And there is, of course, high and lows. And now we have politics in the EU who are not always aligned. We still have a Polish government that were not particularly supportive of the very ambitious target for climate. We have, of course, a big question for Germany on the way to phase out coal. So you see this tension. But you know, looking back, you see that the disappointing moment comes after with more promising moment. But it depends how the European societies react. And of course, we are in a year, well, very soon with the European elections. And so, of course, I would be happy to have even a more clear, in a way, mandate or direction for EU from the Council, but I think it's something we have to come back again. It's always, we are always disappointed, and then we have more pressure, and then we had finally the Green Deal, and now we have to do another discussion and mobilization to get things better. But of course, the result of the European election will be enormously, enormously important.
Do you think there is a risk of climate change falling from the top of the agenda?
Of course, it's maybe a little bit early to tell. For the moment, yes. That's very evident that nobody is thinking climate these days in governments around EU. But we are not at the election moment. We don't know how the different part of the societies in Europe will vote for. So that's, and certainly for a foundation like mine, putting again high on the agenda climate will be important. All the polls we are, in a way, just doing or asking, you see that climate change, and of course because of the impacts, come very, very high. Inflation, of course, is top. Security is very high too, in international security, I mean. And then comes climate change. Only, for example, France, only 12% of French people think that climate change is not a big, big problem. And that is many, many other countries as well. So let's see how this comes in. But we are, yes, we are at risk if we have a move to more climate denialists than there are in Europe still. We can see a backlash And we see in countries some backlash against specific policies. Look at what happened on the heat pumps in Germany, or the low emission zone in many other countries. So that's why I think the new platforms, whatever political party takes it, will have to put social justice at the core of the climate policy if we want to have this new wave of mobilization and commitments and in a way support from societies to the action of government. And of course, the pressure on the business, the financial institution to go along with that. So it's a very crucial moment for Europe. At the moment, in my view, even in these dramatic circumstances, a moment of really rebuilding Europe, a hope for Europe if we can consider if we have a positive signal in December for Ukraine and other countries, it will be a new birth. And I think that could be very enthusiastic, even for... I was in Kiev some weeks ago, and the Zelensky government is so keen to be clean energy, the zero carbon energy. I think that's promising, that gives me hope.
Mm-hmm. You said, I remember hearing you at a webinar, you said we might lose it all if there is the surge of the far-right movements in the EU parliamentary elections next year. Do you think that what we have already gained in terms of climate legislation can be partly then at risk already? Like, can it be not just the risk of not accelerating on climate action as we should, but also what we have achieved so far? Is that a risk?
Well, we are at the moment which we have to translate all the legislation at European level in national law, and that 27 laws. And of course, depending on the political consensus there, even if there are obligations, fortunately, and that anyway, this in a way, legislation was approved by the different councils and the parliament. So we can be afraid of at least lagging behind in some cases to implement, or in a way, well, mostly that, because again, it's an obligation of the treaty. What I'm more worried about is the next phase, frankly. I am not so worried about the implementation of what we have already, because again, of the solidity and the resilience of the EU system, which I think we should recognize. It's exceptional, and it's the protection of our democracy at the same time. But what will happen next time depends a lot of, how the big political parties would consider that climate change and social justice is really part of their main platform. Would they like to put, I don't know, immigration or security at the top, or I don't know, but that's our job, no? To make them thinking that young people in particular will not go vote for them, whoever they are, if they don't put the main concern of this young generation at the core of that platform. Again, now with a notion that it is social justice and climate and by protection of the environment, which should be at the core of this new phase of the EU policy. So hopefully Politico will organize many discussions that make this discussion very clear. But I'm hopeful, some years ago, previous European election, nobody was thinking that the young people would go vote, because they were not. Nobody interested by this election. They went, and that made a whole difference. Let's see what happened in June, next June.
Okay, perfect. Maybe just last very super brief question from the public. Do you think that the EU's climate credibility has suffered from its focus on buying LNG all around the world? So it's focused on energy security of the past 2 years.
Yeah, that I can understand the panic of government in this enormous crisis, the fact that we were, EU was relying on three major hypotheses: security, military security offered by US, cheap energy by Russia, and chip manufacture by China. And all these three assumptions are just questioned, deeply in question. And now we have energy security coming from US, the military security, well, to a certain level, but with question mark for the future. And for China, we have seen the problem. So I do think that this anxiety, we have done very well in 22 and 2023 in terms of energy management. And I think that's the safe direction, to go for more independence. And renewable energy, of course, is the one direction. So I think I hope this will prevail, and not constructing more and more LNG terminal, because that will be evidently not the right direction for the future.
Thank you so much, Laurence. It was really a pleasure. And I invite you, well, maybe a round of applause would be... Thank you. I invite you to remain seated, because my colleague Tia Weise is now going to moderate a panel with 4 MEPs looking back at the Green Deal and what has been achieved so far. Thank you.